Thank you, Dr. Craig Kinner, for the wonderful explanation. Thank you very much for spending your precious time with us. Now, let us listen to the explanation of Reverend Dr. Antonio Portalatin.
Greetings, my brothers and sisters. I am Father Antonio Portalatin, priest of the Diocese of Arecibo, Puerto Rico, and professor of New Testament here at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. I was asked to speak to you today about the question, how can I prove exegetically, that is according to the scriptures, that Peter is the rock of the church in Matthew chapter 16. So I begin reading for you from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16 verse 13 to verse 22, this text. Then when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they say, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gate of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So we see that the words of Jesus about Peter as the rock of the church are in the context of the confession of Peter that Jesus is the Messiah. This confession is the fundament of the church. We confess that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is the one expected since centuries and centuries and prophesied by the prophets. And he would bring the salvation to Israel. You are the Messiah. And then, in the context of this confession, Jesus said to Peter, "You are the rock." This confession in the Gospels, in the tradition, synoptic tradition, that is in the Gospel of Matthew, of Mark, and Luke, is at the center, structurally, of the Gospels. So, the first part of the Gospels is about the ministry of Jesus in Galilee. The second part of the Gospels is about the journey towards Jerusalem, the passion, death, and resurrection of our Lord. And between these two parts is the confession of Peter. We can see that clearly in the Gospel of Mark, the shorter Gospel, 16 chapters. In chapter 8 is the confession of Peter. But also in Matthew and in Luke, we see that between the ministry in Galilee and then the travel towards Jerusalem, there is the confession of Peter and then the word of Jesus. Jesus changed the name of Peter. His original name was Simon. And from Simon, he will be now Kepha, or Peter. Kepha, because the language of Palestine, the language of the apostle, the language of Jesus is Aramaic. And we know from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, that Jesus changed the name to Kepha. And we know from the epistle to the Galatians that Paul says that he went to Jerusalem and he visited Kepha. So the change was to Kepha, that means rock. But then the name is also translated into Greek, Petros, because Greek was the language of the time, of the east part of the empire, and it was also the language of commerce, the language of science, the language of philosophy. Petros, the rock. Some say that here what is important is the confession, not the person. But really it's both things. Because here Jesus is speaking to the person, to Peter. And he is changing the name of a person, Peter, from Simon to Peter. In the Old Testament we know that a change of name means also a mission of God to this person. So happens in the book of Genesis to Abraham. The name is changed because this person, this man, was to be the father of Israel, of many people. And here the change of name is the mission of Peter as the rock. What is the rock? What means rock? If we go to the Old Testament, and especially to the Psalms, we see that God is called rock frequently. For example, in Psalm 18, I read, I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horns of my salvation, my stronghold. What is the rock? It's a fortress, it's a stronghold, it's salvation, it's a refuge. And Jesus is saying, on this rock is Peter, but Peter, inasmuch he is confessing that Jesus is the Messiah, the person and the confession come together. And on this rock, Jesus is building his church. In fact, if I go to the Gospel of Luke, we see the words of Jesus, Simon and Simon, listen, Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat, but I have prayer for you that your own faith may not fail, and you, when once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Luke chapter 22. But Jesus is praying for Peter so that his faith stays faithful forever. And that is the rock. He has this confession, and this confession is going to be there. And he is going to strengthen us in that confession, in that faith. Jesus uses here two symbols that complement the words about Peter as the rock. The first of the symbol is the keys. Is giving the keys to Peter, it says, and giving you the keys. And the symbol is clear. Keys open houses. King is symbol of authority. You have authority in the house. It is really also a symbol of the Old Testament. It is used to name someone who has authority in the palace of David. I read it for you from the prophet Isaiah. On that day I will call my servant Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, and will clothe him with your robe and bind your sash on him. I will commit your authority to his hand, and he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. Isaiah chapter 22. And it says, I will give the key of the house of David, and before have said, I will commit your authority to his hand. He's giving authority. So the same here is giving the keys to Peter, is giving to him authority. The second symbol that he uses to complement the words of the rock is binding and loosing. We don't have a text so clear in the Old Testament about binding and loosing, but in the rabbinic literature after Jesus, it is used in sense of someone who has authority to discipline in the church, in the synagogue in that case. And in Peter, it would mean then someone who has authority also to discipline in the church. So the symbols of the key and loosing and binding. The symbol of loosing and binding appears also in chapter 18 of Matthew, and it refers to the community. And Jesus said to the community, whatever you loose, and it's referring to correction in the community. That also shows how the authority of Peter and the authority of the community are connected, are united. Peter is the rock with the church, but Peter the person. And when Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ, and when the church confesses that Jesus is the Christ, then here we have a rock that is a stronghold for all the people that want to come to have a place of salvation for them and for the future.